Thanks, Concord. I just really wanted to make a couple of quite brief points. I think when we're looking at this bill and the situation of local authority rents, I do think that we need to look at it from a couple of standpoints. The interests of the tenant, clearly the interests of the local authority itself, but I do think it is correct to put it in the context of the overall situation of what's happening outside in the overall real world rental market, or whatever way you want to put it. And, you know, I think other deputies are correct in highlighting during this discussion what's going on out there, because the report that was highlighted in the media last week about the rise in private rents has only vindicated what all of us knew and were saying for a long time in any case, because the reality is when the banks aren't lending money for people to take out new mortgages, then inevitably the prices of the rental sector are going up, and the figures were quite stark, where the average rent now for any property in the state is €815. The gap between the urban and rural areas, which other deputies have highlighted, has been rising steadily over the past number of years, which means we have a serious disconnect in our system, which is ordinary tenants are paying the price of. Now, I'm not going to go through the list of rents and maximum rents allowed in the various local authority areas. Suffice it to say that it is only in the 4 local authorities in Dublin that an amount over the average house price is allowed for, and that's in a maximum 3-bedroom, biggest type house, if you like, scenario. And clearly, on the one hand, that means that the properties in Dublin are greater than the average, so they're not meeting that need there. But it also means that the other figures being allowed in other parts of the country are falling well short. And I'm not going to repeat the points, only to say that this is the cause of enormous financial and emotional stress for many families. We've had many cases of people where they fought to get private rented accommodation in their area, and not being able to meet the demands from the Department of Social Welfare to have that rent lowered, and have had to move out of the area, disconnecting all sorts of other parts of family life, where in many instances you might be talking about a lone parent who has a child with special needs, who they fought to get into the local school. Suddenly now staying in that area isn't a reality. So there is a huge disconnect between different departments, which is having an enormous impact on people who are renting. And I think it's appropriate to start the point based on that, because what's happening in the private sector does feed into what the Minister is trying to do in terms of the overall housing policy. Clearly, this bill is a step in the process of handing over the management of rent supplement to the local authorities, and we do have to take that into account. To me, I think there are positive aspects in that move. It is a good thing that the local authorities would be charged with the management of all housing accommodation, but there's huge dangers in that scenario as well if it's not resourced properly, and it does reflect a moving away from the idea of direct provision to more this idea of housing support, which I don't think is adequate, and I think we've already highlighted that the supports have been well, inadequate, I suppose, is the best way to put it, because you are talking about people moving from secure, relatively permanent, decent accommodation into a much more flexible, transigent, less regulated, with far less security of tenure, and I think that's a difficulty, and I do think we need to look into it a bit. But against that backdrop, obviously people who actually have a council house, who are the beneficiaries of this bill, are the ones who are lucky in that scenario, because I do think that, you know, the differential rent system whereby your rent is linked to your ability to pay is a good thing, and a very good thing, which should be protected. But I would have to say that in recent period, the increases in local authority rents is a concern. Now, I've no doubt that the Department will deny it, but the word on the street in the local authorities is the reason for the rent hike is to cover the demands that are being put on the local authorities for the new home tax, and they need to recoup that money elsewhere. They're already grappling with tenants who have large enough volumes of arrears. Increase in the rent isn't going to exactly help that situation, and I think we do need to be cognizant of that. And I think we need to factor in what is the impact on the maintenance of housing stock of other cutbacks at national level, which can impact on the tenant and therefore impact on rents. Because what we're proposing in this scheme here is to streamline local authority rents around the country, which I think is a good thing. Planning that those rents will be fixed at 12 to 15% of income is a good thing. And allowing councillors the flexibility in deciding those amounts, I think, is a very good thing. We've been long arguing that the removal of powers from councillors has been a retrograde step. It's absolutely essential, actually, that more power would be devolved in the interests of local authorities that would actually probably prefer to see it go further than that. But I think we have to dig deeper. If we're talking about the councils having the power to set rents at these levels and increase them, then we have to look at it in the context of the overall management of housing stock and a certain amount of anomalies that have arisen in that regard. If you take the local authority that I know best myself, Fingal County Council, presently charges tenants €3 a week for boiler maintenance. That's €150 a year on top of your rent. Now, to me, that's certainly an amount I don't pay. I think it's an astronomical amount to have your boiler maintained, but they say they have to do that because if there's a flaw in the system and they need to have it repaired, then the local authority can't absorb the cuts because their central budgets have been impacted upon. We have many tenants who have poorly conditioned windows and doors. It really annoys them when a house becomes vacant and the local authority immediately moves in, does that house up, puts in new windows, new doors, and the person gets a properly energy efficient house to move into, which obviously we would welcome. But the loyal tenant who's been a tenant of the local authority for years says here, what about me? And I do think we need to join it up because, Minister Rabbitte on Friday launched a whole policy, or I don't know what he was doing, actually seems to do these every day in the week, but anyway, put out a few press releases anyway, arguing correctly that energy efficient homes are the long-term solution to fuel poverty. And he is correct in that. But what about our housing stock, where the windows are drafty, the structures aren't proper, and people are actually spending more just to keep themselves warm in our house because the local authorities aren't being adequately funded to bring that house up to standard. And I think these things feed in to an overall change in the situation when we're talking about the powers of local authorities to set rents and to streamline rents, because there are very big differences. I think there are differences in relation to local authority dwellings which have been taken over but are being run by management companies, and where the tenant is not only paying a fee to the local authority in rent, but is also paying on top of that, and in some instances I've seen it €10–15 in a management fee because they're living in an apartment as well on top of their rent. And for somebody who's on a social welfare income, this is highly onerous demand on their income. So when we're talking about changing this, I do think we need to look at the bigger picture, because there's no point in giving the local authorities the power to increase rents if it means it's going to drive somebody over the edge, and the only result of it is going to be, apart from the stress on that person, is that the local authorities' arrears are going to get bigger in dealing with it. And I would like to see how it fits in with the whole area of incentives or initiatives that will be undertaken to bring housing stock up to adequate standard to meet all of the new standards that are there. To build in issues like, what if the tenant themselves actually is in a position to improve the state of the house and would like to invest in that? Can we link in the rent system with some ability to improve the housing stock for the benefit of everybody? So I suppose, I don't think there's anything hugely wrong with the bill. I do have some questions about this move to an over-reliance on the idea of support rather than direct provision, which I think has stood the test of time, has been a desirable outcome where people have a stake in their community. And I do think now that we've so many unwilling landlords, if you like, people who've bought not a house for an investment but a home that they can't afford to live in, that they're now renting out. They'd get rid of it if they could, but it's in negative equity, and if they walk away, they're afraid they'll have the debt with it. Presumably the state could do some deal with the banks to take over those units and have the debt of the individual written off, so that we can improve the housing stock and look at a better area of security of tenure, because I think there is an overemphasis actually and reliance on the private market in an overall sense.
Thanks, Deputy. And next